friends, this is an afternoon which every one of us would long to have with us a person of her eminence, a presence like Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai. Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai, she is, not needless to say, the celebrated dancer and choreographer, has achieved an international reputation that is unmatched by any contemporary Indian classical dancer. The syntax of her creativity mediates between a moral commitment to traditional form and the desire to claim one's own experiments as unique and unrepeatable. This interface of technical mastery and creative expressionism achieves a profoundly versatile language of the body, simple, eloquent, visually inspiring. She is the founder director of the Darpana Academy of Performing Arts, Ahmedabad, which came into being in 1949. She has traveled extensively all over the world and has received many distinguished national and international awards and citations for her contribution to the preservation of Indian classical dance. The detailed resume of hers is in the booklet, but she really needs no introduction. I personally have been always attracted to what she writes in spite of her ideas and inspiration for classical dance. So at the outset, let me welcome her and thank her on behalf of the director of this institute who had to go to Delhi today and therefore not able to be here. So let me welcome her and thank her on behalf of the director, NIAS, and all of us here for taking the trouble of coming from Ahmedabad. I know that taking a long flight from Ahmedabad to Bangalore, almost 3.5 hours flight, and being here and inspiring all of us by your sheer presence. Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai.
Darshanam to everybody, because darshanam is both ways, to you and from you to me. I'm really not a speaker, and I've always been scared of standing up at a podium and addressing all the learned people here, because it's so much easier for me to give you a performance. But as I was so affectionately invited, I thought I should come, not so much to talk to you, but to hear what you said. And I was just thinking that science and dance are so close in a way, and yet sometimes we separate ourselves. Being married to a scientist, we often shared our views while looking at the sky, and he would, though he was a poet too, but he would look at the sky in one way and see the rays and the cosmic rays falling. And I would tell him, yes, I see that, but don't you see the arm of the dancer going this way and holding the cloud in her hand? And do you see the patterns of the sky? And from that, both of us would derive great happiness. And once I remember telling him that, scientists always feel they discover something new. And I would read him this poem, which I brought here, of how somebody wrote about coming down in an aeroplane. Flying down to earth, great mountains look like baby elephants. The seas like tiny swimming pools. Trees resembled a mass carpet. The valleys are hidden. Rivers are just streams of lines. And great palaces, great institutions are but small dewdrops. Whose was this vision? It was not Gagarin, the first modern man who saw our planet from outer space. These words were the vision of our poet Bas, who lived even before Kalidasa. I remember when the first aeroplanes arrived in India, when I was a small child, and in Kerala, my grandmother said, I said to her with great excitement that, people are flying all over the world and they're wonderful. She said, that's nothing. We had them long ago in the Mahabharata times. What's new? So sometimes we think that we have discovered new things, and we find really that through our classical art, we learn from the Mahabharata, from the Ramayana, from the Iliad and the Oedipus. So many things have happened before, and we rediscover them in life. I think the very statement that was made by the last speaker, Tattvam Asi, thou art that I am. And I think those are the most profound words when we're talking about darshanam. Because darshanam is not only my looking at you, but you are looking at me. And what we share is the infinite between us. And I think this is what the world is all about. And the sooner we realize the oneness of our small earth, the better. Unfortunately, humankind hasn't really changed enough to realize that great truth of oneness. I was asked to speak on the concept of beauty in Indian aesthetics. So I tried to put together a few words that in every aspect of Indian classical tradition, the beauty of the human being has been compared to the elements of nature. There's an exquisite love scene from the Tamil epic, the Shilpadikaram, which speaks of the hero Kovalan's first night with his beloved Kannagi. The scene was as if the sun and moon had together bathed the entire world, clasped by the sea in their light. He wore a wreath of jasmines in bloom, a garland of shimmering red and purple-white lilies. Kovalan tells his beloved, "Dear Kannaki, wasn't the moon born with you when it became your forehead? And Kama, the shadowy god of love, pledged his sugarcane bow to you when it became your two dark eyebrows. Eclipsed by your beauty, the bejeweled peacock which hides itself in the fresh woods, helpless before your elegant step, the swan vanishes into a field of limpid water." I remember once taking a workshop in America, in New York, and I told them that you must learn to be Indian in a very short time, as we were doing a Sanskrit play. It was Swapna Vasvadatta, the vision of Vasvadatta. So they asked me, "Do you want us to look Indian?" I said, "There's no looking Indian. I want you to be Indian from inside, not outside. We have all types in India. So be Indian from your inside." And then I said, "First you must learn to walk like elephants." And they said, "What?" And I said, "Do you know that the elephants walk so beautifully? Have you all seen an elephant? Have you studied how an elephant walks? Would you like me to show you?" If you see an elephant, it is so huge and cumbersome, but have you noticed how it walks? Slowly putting its foot down, slowly, not like we walk today. The beauty of nature is always, even the peacock is walking, looks around, this loveliness. And so when I said walk like an elephant, of course I had to express it myself. The association of nature, the birds, the animals, the universal features of the forest glades to human beauty and energy were symbolic of India's close affiliation with nature. The moon gave radiance to the face of the beloved. The eyes resemble the deer, or like the goddess Meenakshi, the fish. The fish-like eyes are always called most beautiful. When the bees hover around Shakuntala in Kalidasa's Shakuntala play, the King Dushyanta remarks, "Again and again you touch her quivering eyes with their tremulous corners. Having beside her ear, you hum sweetly as though whispering a secret. Though she moves her hand, you drink the nectar of her lower lip, the essence of joy. Oh, bee, you are indeed blessed." And the bee is somehow used a great deal in India for telling a story. For instance, in Kathakali, they say that when you have a beautiful lotus flower, you will tell me, there's a beautiful lotus flower, and then are attracted by the honey in the lotus flower. And so they all gather into the lotus flower, and they drink the honey. And as soon as they drank the honey, they're sitting, they fly away. And so, all human beings, when you speak sweet words, and when you are young and beautiful, all the bees come to you. And when you are old and alone, all the bees fly away. So all life is always compared to all these wonderful natural kind of scenes. So that when we learn dancing, we first learn the mudras that are important. And we are told our stories. For instance, this morning we were talking about wisdom, jnana. The first mudra we learn is jnana mudra. And we were talking about meditation. When in meditation, usually, you have the jnana mudra when you sit down. The sadhus tell you, do the jnana mudra. But you don't know that if you do this mudra, even without sitting down, it is one of the most healing mudras possible. I was going to tell you today, do the Shankha mudra for your throat. The Shankha mudra, the mudra of the conch, is the best antidote for a sore throat. So we learn that mudras are not only for describing, but also for healing. The mudra of the little finger for those who suffer from any kind of rheumatism or any kind like that. When you're sitting at a meeting, don't be a dancer, but do this mudra. And so mudras had a lot of things apart from showing nature and beauty and talking to people. In the Buddhist theology, there was a meeting like this, and there was a beautiful girl and a handsome man. And he said to her, he couldn't talk because the great Buddha was speaking, but he just did this. Are you married? And she from across the room said, well, everyone can understand that. So mudras, dance was used in every sphere of life. When as I was saying, the bee has a special place in people's heart, perhaps not only for honey, but as a protector. Vishnu in the Rig Veda is symbolized as a blue-colored bee resting again on a lotus. And Kamadeva's bow has a bee strung and fashioned from a cluster of bees. In the philosophical Saundarya Lahari of Shankaracharya, which extols the beauty of Devi in ecstatic forms, the poet writes, with naturally curly locks, as beautiful bees encircling it, your face shames the beauty of a lotus. When your eyebrows are slightly arched, O you who are devoted to banishing the fear of the worlds, the beauty of your limbs is like paths of splendor from the fresh sun, strung with your two eyes, which are like bees. Bees represented signs of love hovering around the beloved, as most of you know in Kalidasa Shakuntala, which I'm sure all of you have read. But it is not only in Shakuntala, but in the story of Nala and Damayanti, it was not the bees, but the swan. These beautiful animals of nature, the trees, the animals, the birds, they all carried messages of love. It was so much more romantic than today when you send email instead. However, the animals and the bees and birds are getting much fewer and much less with modern civilization. So let us all hope you can bring them back. The story of Nala Damayanti is very beautiful, and many of you know it, but I'm going to repeat it because Nala of Nishada wanted to seek the hand of the beautiful Princess Draupadi, who was courted by the gods. So from his palace, he doesn't send an email, he sends a swan. And he sends a swan to woo her, and Damayanti is captivated. There's a whole scene in Kathakali where the swan walks and Nala tries to capture the swan. It's a beautiful piece where he entices the bird. And of course the bird wants to be captured because the bird has the message from Damayanti. But there's a sort of teasing about Nala and the swan, which is one of the loveliest pieces that you can, I wish I could show that all to you in dance. A moving scene then tells of Damayanti how she captures the golden swan. The swan not only whispers to her, but leads her to a secluded part of the garden and says, "O Princess Damayanti, there is a king named Nala who has no peer among men. In my wanderings, I have seen no one equal to Nala, and his energy is like the ceaseless flow of the Ganga river." See again the comparison to a river and a man. His energy is like the Ganga river. Now, of course, they're damming most of the rivers, so there may not be a ceaseless flow. We are having the trouble with the Sabarmati in Ahmedabad, where everyone thinks should be just, I don't know what to say because I'm also in ecology, but I feel so many of these modern works of damming rivers and so on stops this wonderful ceaseless flow and makes them not so beautiful or vigorous as they were, almost as we do with human beings. When the marriage was celebrated between Nala and Damayanti, the beautiful palace was decorated with images of nature. In a multitude of color, the queen of the Nagas rising from Patala was depicted. At the top of the pillar was a picture drawn of Garuda. The brocade hangings were patterned with images of birds and with emeralds, rubies, and pearls. The garments of the women looked like white moonlight, the color of jasmine flowers, and emeralds looked like the green of the young bamboos which they decorated. You can imagine how beautifully nature was depicted in the palaces too. Damayanti herself was gorgeously dressed. As Nala entered the room, her dark, deep-like eyes, like pools, shone in the moonlight, and as she smiled, her teeth was white as the jasmine petals. Of course, nowadays they're made for us, but her teeth were like white jasmine petals. Nature in Sanskrit poetry encourages lovers and helps them to meet together. A leaf is a letter on which Shakuntala writes to the king. But today we do not have these leaves, though we have still many manuscripts written on palm leaves. The Natya Shastra of Bharata, which I studied, was a valuable treatise written on ola, or leaves. In Orissa, as you know, this tradition still continues. In the play of Vikram Urvashyam, the Vidushaka, or the jester, tells the king Vikram, "The bower of Atimukta creepers has a seat to receive you, having dropped flowers because of the black bees clashing against them. Sitting here, you may forget your longing for the beautiful Urvashi, but you may write her a letter. But be careful when you pluck the tree of its leaves, and do not harm its bark." All our ancient stories, poetry, music, dance, nature plays an important part. After a dance performance, apart from golden coins, the dancers received a crown of green leaves, as said in Salapadikaram, the great Tamil classic. And an ancient story tells us of the origin of music, which the great sage Swati discovered. Sati once went to collect water at a pond. Large raindrops, driven by the wind, struck the lotus leaves. He saw and heard the nada, went back to his hermitage, and contemplated the creation of sounds on an earthen pot. And that is how the first mridangam was made, which you all listen to today. Even kings had as their emblems tigers and lions adorned their flags, and Tamil poetry pays homage to the elements in songs of praise. I want to read you an ancient Tamil poem which says, "Let us bless the moon, let us bless the moon, like an umbrella of let us bless the sun, let us bless the eternal traveler around the golden Mount Meru, a symbol of the loved king of the Lord of the Kaveri river. We bless the rain, pouring from on high, Genesis, the ruler of the earth, surrounded by the sea. Never loved the earth. Nature has been an important aspect of all the artistic heritage of deep spiritual insight. When I first went to Tiruvannamalai, I was very young and I was in search of, I can't say peace at that age, but I was in search of knowledge. I was in search of the great heritage of our country. And I was very young and saw Ramana Maharshi. Because at that time I didn't know how great a sage he was. And I was hiding behind the skirt of my mother, and suddenly he turned and he just asked her to stand aside. And I looked up at him, and I had been told to namaskar, so I tried to namaskar. And he just looked at me. "You will be all right," he said in Tamil. "You will be all right." I've never forgotten his eyes, his look, and the power of this man just sitting in this very humble place. And that is what you were talking about this morning, about meditation. I have tried to meditate. I tried from that day on. I never could succeed. I never could sit still. That was my problem. So once I went much later to Swami Chinmayananda, and I said, "Swamiji, I just can't sit and meditate." And he said to me, "We sit and meditate because we can't dance." He said, "Your meditation is much greater." And I realized that because when I dance, it's the only time I feel really one with the universe. And when one dances, one really forgets everything. And sometimes one is almost unconscious of what one is doing. I say this not because of myself, but because I'm trying to tell you of the feeling when one gets into dance. It is real meditation. I remember once, it was I think in Bangalore itself, yes, I was doing Krishnani Begani Baro, which is a great favorite of mine. "Krishna, come here, let me see thy face." And while I was doing Krishna, I quite forgot, I saw him there. In my imagination perhaps, but I saw him and I stood and I waited for him. And it was as the whole audience just waited for me to move, and I didn't move for at least about 3 minutes. And afterwards, 2 or 3 of them came and asked me, "What happened?" And I said, "I don't know. I think he was there." And I said this to Swamiji and Swami Dayananda this time, and Swami Dayananda said, "Mrinal, that is meditation. And this is what I could never get by sitting still." So sometimes it is not while you're sitting still that you meditate, but while you're one with your own self. There are all moments in time when suddenly one realizes oneself within. And one says suddenly, this is me, not the person talking to you, not the person lecturing you, but just in a moment, this is me. This is the person connected with the entire universe. And it is that moment of meditation that is so precious. But I'm not sticking to my speech, I'm sorry. When I started about meditation, what I wanted to say, what is interesting, that most great people found enlightenment under trees and made also images much out of wood. But the reverence in India for these trees and nature, in ancient India at least, when Narada Muni speaks, and these trees were being cut to make images of gods. And he says, "O thou tree, salutations. Thou art to be selected, to be carved into this sacred image. Please accept this offering. May all the spirits residing in this tree transfer their habitation. Elsewhere, go elsewhere, after accepting the offering made according to our ruler. May they pardon me today for disturbing them." What a beautiful way of cutting a tree with so much apology, and that too the tree that was to be made into an image of God. And now when I see how trees are cut in our country and the desecration that goes on, because I remember, I think it was Sir Jagdish Chandra Bose who said that when a flower was he did show an image, I think it was Vikram who showed it to me. He said how a flower, even when it's being taken, goes like this. And now, whenever I pluck a flower, I always say, of course I do pluck flowers, I say, "May I pluck you?" Because suddenly you get this tremendous affinity with nature. And people laugh at me and say, you're more fond of trees than of us. But it's true, because when Swamiji once told me that you should meditate only under a tree and put your back against the tree, because that is how you will be helped in meditation. And that's what I do now. Not always meditate, but even when I think of a new dance drama or of a new idea, I always go under a big tree, put my back against the tree, and try to think of a new idea. And I think the trees help us. I think I get inspiration from that. But let us go from trees to love poems. Love poems to Krishna dominate Indian literature and dance. Of course, Jayadeva's Gita Govindam, known to you all, and one of Krishna's words to Radha depict the great affiliation of art to nature's beauty. Krishna tells his beloved, "Your moist lips glow like crimson banduka flowers. Your tender cheeks are like pale maduka petals. Angry Radha, your eyes defeat the dark blue lotuses in beauty. Your nose is like a sesame flower. A veiling of the beauty of your face, love's flower conquers all the world." These are all different, and I can go on and on about the beauty of nature. And even Nataraja, the god of dance. I'm going to just recite to you a poem and then just end my talk by showing it to you. May I? It's a favorite of mine, but it shows again nature, God, and us. The hands that bless the world, with arms ornamented with coiled serpents. Round thy waist the tiger skin, and the crescent moon in thy matted hair. Lotus-shaped feet decorated by anklets. Thou, O merciful one, what beauty has thy face, O three-eyed one. Blue-throated art thou, the sacred thread across thy beautiful chest, and the ashes of purity sprinkled on thy body, holding thy symbols with a slender-waisted Parvati beside thee, with the strength of his purity within me, can you, O my heart, ever be afraid? When we dance these lines day in and day out, for the dancer, that is the greatest meditation. I used to end with this very often in my programs in Europe, and even though people didn't understand the language, I would explain it a little like this. And it's amazing the different reaction I got for this small verse, because I did describe to them, as all of you know, about Nataraja, the god of dance, and the symbol of his beautiful form that we see in so many statues in India. That is a whole history in itself, and it has been compared scientifically also, which I'm sure you all know. But still, the inner beauty, the inner meaning to me is more important, because that is what the universe is made of. Science and art.
அஞ்சலென்ற கரதலமும் பணிகண கங்கணமும் அரை கிஷைந்த உலியுடையும் அம்புலே செஞ்சடையும் கஞ்சமலர் சேவடியும் கணை கழலும் சிலம்பும் கருணை பொழி திருமுகமும் கண்கள் ஒரு மூன்றும் நெஞ்சணிந்த மணிமிடரும் நூல் மார்பும் நலம் திகழ் வெண்ணீரொளியும் மரிமானும் மழுவும் பஞ்சடி சிற்றிடையுமையா ஒப்பனை பாகமுமா பால்வண்ணன் உள்ளத்திருக்க பயமுண்டோ எமக்கே பயமுண்டோ எமக்கே
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful words and the beautiful snippets from you. Thank you very much. We can take a few questions. I know that this is not, this is something which you have to just stay and enjoy and be with, but still if you have a few questions, we can take it. Yes, Professor Mahadevan.
Very wonderful. My question is, in spite of our rich cultural heritage, there is every effort made now to belittle romantic love. There were so many incidents in the recent past. Now, why is this happening? Is there any sociological or any explanation for what is happening?
I don't know, because I'm puzzled too about it, but I think there's so many influences just now, and children have so many other occupations, and I think, but I do feel that there always has been this. It isn't something new. There have always been two sides of every art. And so sometimes if they are taken away from the classical art, but the classical art has become stronger now because it's spread all over the world. And you'll be surprised how many dedicated students I get. Our course is 6 years, but we get students from all over the world now doing Bharatanatyam, Kathakali, Kalari. And there's a great upsurge of the need for knowledge. And I think that goes side by side. Like the Amrita Mandram, there's always the churning of the ocean. And that churning goes on.
My point was, society looks down upon romantic love. It's strongly discouraged now.
I haven't seen anyone looking down on romantic stuff. I'm still romantic. I think people are still romantic. It's romance in a different way. I mean, this kind of romance, Well, it's romance all the same. You see, sometimes what is beautiful to us may not be beautiful to somebody else. So, I mean, something jazzy or something, it appeals at that time. These things are like the waves of the sea. They come, they go. But the underneath of the sea, the strong thing stays on forever. I believe that.
Any other questions? Yes. Thank you also.
Your whole family is from a very artistic as well as a scientific background, and I also get the point that since you said that you have met Ramana Maharishi at a very young age, he was the substratum of silence, and coming from that angle, would you say that inspiration of art comes from silence? And you also stressed about the point of the inner search and the rest from where all your enthusiasm comes. So would you like to throw more light on the silence, what you are experiencing, and the inspiration, what you draw from the silence? Because beauty is ultimately converging at silence. Thank you.
Now, of course, I think everything does come from silence. And often when you are thinking, even scientists, however down to earth they may be, which they are not, it has to come from an inner feeling, and that comes from silence. You don't have to meditate. Even if you sit just looking out at the sea for some time, it's meditation. If you just sit by yourself under a tree, as I said, that's meditation. There are a lot of people who want methodology of meditation. That is also meditation, because sometimes one has to study a technique. But I think everything comes from the silence, from the depths of your own being. It's not always from somewhere above or somewhere around. But as I said, Tattvamasi, you are that I am that I am. And I believe in reincarnation. I believe in it because I myself went into dance in a very non-dancing political family. But I told my mother at 3 that I'm a dancer. And in our house we didn't know, though I came from Madras, didn't know much about dance or music. We were all a very political family. So I do believe more and more that we come we are here, and we go into somewhere else perhaps. And I tell my students at Darpana means a mirror, as you know, and it's a mirror of life and of your thoughts. And I tell them every morning, which I learned from Ramana Maharshi, every morning look in the mirror and ask yourselves, who am I? What am I doing? Where am I going? This is an exercise all our students do every morning. And I think it has helped them a great deal. And that is the silence.
During your presentation, you said about a particular performance where a couple of minutes you were not aware of anything and you're just still. Can you throw a little more light about it? Because a lot of people say this is a kind of meditation, or this is a kind of samadhi where a lot of people go. They say a lot of people who are in the art, they usually go into this, and it's difficult for a normal man. Can you throw a little more light on this?
Yes, well, I can't throw much light on it because it was while I was dancing and I was doing Krishnani Begani Baro, which many people here I'm sure know. And when I was doing Krishna, I suddenly felt that Krishna, something was there. And my guru at that time was from Bangalore called Guru Ellappa. And Ellappa was a beautiful singer. That also might have contributed, mind you, to the beauty of the music. And I just don't remember what happened. But he told me afterwards that, you know, for about 2-3 minutes, he didn't know exactly, but he said, suddenly I didn't know, so I went on singing Krishnani Begani Baro, and I didn't go on to the next line. And when I moved, of course, he went on. But it's often happened to me when I dance that really existence stops. And I feel that that is my meditation. And it's not done purposefully, or it's not done because of this, or because, it's just a feeling while I'm dancing that suddenly something happens. And perhaps I'm so in it, like a musician perhaps is so much into his art, into his music. But I can sometimes just hear a flute in the distance. At night in India, very often, you hear music in the distance, not jazz, but a flute somewhere, or a bean somewhere in North India, or just a drum. It can really make you go into meditation. But listen. None of us listen. I've seen, I make my students often just sit and listen to silence. There will be sounds, but the sounds are part of that silence. So just listen, just sit 5 minutes every day and listen.
Yes, here.
And I think in Indian performance that different kind of deities and all, you will be representing sometime Krishna, sometime Nataraja, so many deities you have to represent. And the experience that you said, you are feeling that Krishna is standing in front of you. Have you ever felt while performing the Krishna that you yourself, that okay, I have myself have feeling that I am the Krishnan, or something like I have forgotten that Krishna Bhava has come out of me. That's the actual meaning of the, I think,
Yes.
mudras they say.
Yes.
Have you ever felt that?
Yes, very often.
Because you have been practicing it.
Yes, of course.
That Krishna mudra,
Yes.
Nataraja mudra, that has
Yes.
naturally come out of me.
Yes, of the feeling.
Can you, any incident?
Well, there are so many incidents, I can't tell them all. But I'll tell you a funny incident, no, not related to your question. It happens very often. But with me, I think perhaps it happens more with Krishna, because I don't know why. I really don't know why. I think it's from the past life. When I dance of Shiva, for instance, I find I'm a little scared of Shiva. He's a very stern god. And though Nataraja is our god of dancers, I'm much closer to Krishna. He seems to me much closer to me. I mean, this is all a very personal thing, but it comes out in my work. I've just written a dance drama on Krishna with South Indian tunes, but in English. And the children just have been dancing it, and now many schools have been dancing it, and it's all again Krishna. You see, it came to me just like that. And my next dance drama, strangely, is going to be about Hanuman. And so often these thoughts just come to me. I mean, Hanuman was not in my mind, but the thoughts come to me. And so I begin to think of it just like that. So it's not that I find something, that something finds me very often. And I think in dance you get geared up, sensitive to the atmosphere around you. And when you're very sensitive and you're wanting something to come. I remember when I was, am I boring people?
No, not at all.
I remember when we were doing Shakuntala, and I did a modern version of Shakuntala that I brought all the people on the stage, which was the world. The Kanva Maharishi and everybody was on the stage, because I said, this is life. And Shakuntala's story I enacted. So she would go to her companions first and so on, and then to Kanva Maharishi and so on. And at the end, the king asks, where is the ring? You all know Shakuntala's story, the ring is lost. He says, where is the ring? And it took me days to know. I mean, the story says the ring was eaten by a fish and so on. I didn't take that. Where is the ring? So finally, at 2 in the morning, I woke up and I thought, oh, I know where the ring is. So the next day I went, and Shakuntala asked the king that if it's a signet ring and it belongs to the king, it must still be with you. You should never have parted with it, so it must still be with you. And then she goes round to each person and she says to her father, Kanva Maharishi, you didn't tell me to be careful of the ring. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you bring me up in such isolation? She goes to her companions and says, you didn't help me. You should have told me, hang on to that wretched ring. Then she goes to the king and said, you're not the king. Why don't you hang on to your ring? It's your ring, and you shouldn't have given it to anybody. And she goes around and she says, we come into the world alone, we go out alone. So how an old story, what should I say, repeated or retranslated into a modern version of what life is. And the stage was the whole of life, and these were incidents that happened to all of us, and how we react to these incidents.
Yes, Dilip.
Hello, I am Atreya. They say the art is a form of expression and dance is one of the forms of art. And you say even art is a search for inner self, but something which has been expressed becomes an object. But how do you take it as an inner search? Or even the process of expression is something outward. How do you explain this contradiction of search for inner self and an expressed one?
I don't think it's a contradiction, because it's a reflection. Art is a reflection of life. And a reflection of life is both outer and inner. It's how you react to people, how you react to yourself. So reflection only means like a mirror, abhinaya-the, mirror of life. And so it is mirroring life as I see it. And I see it as others see it too. So it's both really. That is why it's so wonderful about our art, because it reflects life and it also gives an idea, a suggestion of one's own self into life. So it's both ways really. Otherwise we wouldn't really dance on the stage if it was such an inner thing. I dance in my room. But we are sharing our experience with the outer world.
Sharada.
First of all, thank you, Mrinalini. It's such a privilege and pleasure to hear you and sharing your wonderful art and insights. I was just curious because you've been a great exponent of both Bharatanatyam and Kathakali, and I just wanted to know, in your experience with Abhinaya in Bharatanatyam and Kathakali, obviously the mudras and all that are different, but is there any qualitative difference in the way, rasa is expressed or such like, or, what, as an artist, I'd just like some, insights on that.
Well, Bharatanatyam is much more natural, much more, shall I say, much more the ordinary human expression. The girl's expression is just really what is normally used, that you exaggerate a little bit. I don't want you. But you say that to, sometimes to your husband or to your lover, I don't want you, that sort of expression. Or come. In Kathakali, it's more stylized, but what happened with me is that when I saw Kathakali, the woman's role is much less. It is not exaggerated like the man's role. And so I liked it very much. And at that time, women were not dancing Kathakali. Men were dancing as women. And I felt as I came from Kerala also, and I loved the movement. Whereas Bharatanatyam is very strong. Different enough. It's like you're saying, can I learn Spanish and English? When you're learning Spanish, you're Spanish. When you look at you, you're talking to me in a foreign tongue. But we talk English like we are English. So it's just when I talk to somebody who knows only Gujarati, I will talk in a very different kind of Gujarati. When I talk Tamil, I talk differently. It's just a mindset, really.
The last question.
Thank you very much for the wonderful performance. I just wanted to ask, you spoke about the inner self and the search for beauty. I just wanted to elicit your advice. I mean, in a highly individualistic, commercialized, tension-filled day-to-day life, I mean, could you very kindly just suggest, ways or means to cultivate this, inner silence and sensitivity to, beauty. I mean, how can we cultivate it?
I think one can cultivate it. I'm not saying with meditation, because sometimes meditation is difficult for people who are very active, and I think do Surya Namaskar. Surya Namaskar is a set of only 8 exercises. Do it every morning about 10-15 times. It's very simple. I make all our people who are doing different subjects, not dance, do Surya Namaskar. I think all of you know Surya Namaskar. And it's a simple exercise which really has yoga, has meditation, has everything in it. And for active people, most of our young people are so active today, they can't just sit down and I have to make them sit down and keep quiet. Even that is difficult. But we start our day with Surya Namaskar and a few yoga exercises, but Surya Namaskar I find is the best thing. And you can get books on Surya Namaskar. It's only a series of 8 movements. And you can do them any number of times. And you can talk to yourself if you like while you do them, and you'll soon find you stop talking to yourself.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai. She said she did not know how to sit and meditate, but she also said that she teaches her students to listen to the very subtle sounds in the moments of silence. What else form of meditation can we look for? Thank you so much, Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai.
Thank you for inviting me.
This beautiful moments you shared with us. And we would really think this would be a kind of best conclusion for this conference. But though we have 2 more sessions to follow, but we thank you so much for taking the trouble to come here and share your ideas and presence with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now we break for tea and join back at 3:30 to listen to another dancer, but I think she would be rather talking about her work rather than dancing, Sharada Srinivasan. We have come to the last but one session, the lecture by Dr. Sharada Srinivasan. I thought it's most appropriate to have a lecture given after the presentation by Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai, because she is also an equally accomplished dancer, and she is a very versatile personality, being one of the country's very well-known archaeometallurgist, and her expertise in artistry, conservation science, and scientific applications in artistry, archaeology, museum studies, and so on, well represented in her papers. Her detailed profile is there in the booklet. Now let me invite Dr. Sharada Srinivasan to make the presentation. The time is 20 minutes for your presentation and then 10 minutes for discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sangeetha. It's a very difficult act to follow after Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai's very wonderful exposition, but there we are. So my talk is entitled Art and Archaeology of Nataraja Bronzes, Exploring Visual Metaphors for Consciousness. The 10th century Chola metal image of Nataraja from Tamil Nadu in southern India, representing the Ananda Tandava or Dance of Bliss, is one of the most artistically acclaimed and well-known symbols of Indian culture, which has invited the attention of several philosophers and scientists and so on. And the sculptor Rodin extolled the Nataraja in an essay La Danse de Shiva, and Ananda Kumar Swami in his exposition of 1918, The Dance of Shiva, described the image as poetry but nonetheless science. And what I'll attempt in this paper is to show that the Nataraja religious icon does provide a unique historical case study in exploring perspectives from art and philosophy, in attempting to arrive at some sort of understanding of notions related to consciousness and the cosmos, and also thereby providing something of a visual metaphor for apprehending such abstractions. Of course, not all of these metaphors were necessarily part of its original conception, and it's probably interesting to note that there's been this process of accretion of symbolic meanings over time. In fact, continuing right into the modern day, as seen clearly in the writings of those of a scientific background. And I'll quote from Carl Sagan's Cosmos. The Chola bronzes cast in the 11th century include several different incarnations of the god Shiva. The most elegant and sublime of these is a representation of the creation of the universe at the beginning of each cosmic cycle, a motif known as the cosmic dance of Shiva. The god, called in this manifestation the dance king, has 4 hands. In the upper right is a drum whose sound is the sound of creation. In the upper left is a tongue of flame, a reminder that the universe, now newly created, will billions of years from now be utterly destroyed. These profound and lovely images are, I like to imagine, a kind of premonition of modern astronomical ideas. And he goes on to say that the Hindu religion is the only one of the world's great faiths dedicated to the idea that the cosmos itself undergoes an immense, indeed, an infinite number of deaths and rebirths. It is the only religion where time scales correspond, no doubt by accident, to those of modern scientific cosmology. Now, I'm happy to show this painting, Cosmic Dance, which was kindly given to me by the well-known Belgian painter and Indologist Jean Leschet, who unfortunately couldn't be here today since he was unwell. And I'll also point to a comment by Jean Leschet from his abstract, which provides a useful contextual framework perhaps for my own paper. He makes the point that we can derive 2 epistemological approaches to the understanding of consciousness, one that is essentially verbal and rational, and the other that is basically visual, analogical, and evocative, which is a realm into which Indian religious iconography essentially falls. However, what I'm addressing in this paper is more of a historical problem and is less concerned directly with the implications for consciousness research per se. And the point of my paper is that whereas in popular understanding the Nataraja metal icon is thought to have come into vogue under the 10th century Chola period, and whereas the more metaphysical connotations of the icon, linking it to the cosmos and consciousness, are in evidence in Shaiva Siddhantic texts of the 12th to 13th century, I will essentially be pointing to scientific and literary evidence to suggest that these aspects, in fact, go back possibly to the Pallava period of the 8th-9th century. Now, based on 13th century Tamil Shaiva Siddhantic texts composed at Chidambaram, where the dancing Nataraja image is worshipped, Ananda Kumaraswamy famously interpreted the Ananda Tandava, or the cosmic dance, dance of bliss, where Shiva performs the 5 acts of Panchakritya, that is creation, which is symbolized by the drum, destruction by the fire, and protection by the front right arm, solace by the crossed left arm, the dispelling of ignorance by the trampling of the demon Apasmara underfoot, and the ring of fire representing the perpetual cosmic cycles of creation and destruction.
And in his essay, Dance of Shiva, he says that the dance in fact represents Srishti, preservation, Samhara, destruction, Tirobhava, or veiling or illusion, Anugraha, salvation or grace. And Unmai Vilakam says, creation arises from the drum, protection proceeds from the hand of hope, from fire proceeds destruction. The foot held aloft gives release. Now, there's also this translation from the 13th century Shaiva Siddhantic text, which compares Shiva to the Supreme Intelligence. The Supreme Intelligence dances in the soul for the purpose of removing our sins. By these means, our Father scatters the darkness of illusion, Maya, burns the thread of causality, stamps down evil, Mala, showers grace, and lovingly plunges the soul into the ocean of bliss, or Ananda. Now, Ananda Kumar Swami's writings, of course, in turn also inspired others, perhaps no more than the physicist turned writer Fritjof Capra, who in his cult book of the 70s, The Tao of Physics, mapped a bubble chamber onto the bronze Nataraja and wrote that for modern physicists, Shiva's dance is the dance of subatomic particles. And this is a rear view of the flying matted locks of the dancing Shiva, which is said to hold the river Ganga, which I suppose metaphorically can be seen to suggest the web of consciousness and intelligence extending outwards. I mean, it's one can always construe all sorts of things from these metaphors. And the slide next to it is a cosmic ray shower in Fritjof Capra's Tao of Physics, which also poetically brings to mind Shiva Nataraja's flying locks. But so much for the metaphors. Coming to the hard question of, but what were the origins and the original significance of the Nataraja metal icon, and to what extent was its formulation really informed of cosmic comprehension and linked to the consciousness and so on? I mean, there are some problems with Kumaraswami's interpretations and also David Spritz's interpretations and all, since these are derived from later 13th century texts, whereas the icon is really best known from the 10th century Chola period. And there are also other readings into the significance of the Nataraja. For example, Padma Kaimal has argued that the real significance of the Nataraja, at least in the Chola period, lay in its being a political statement of the martial prowess of the Cholas, recalling to the martial victory dance of the goddess Kottravai. And there are other readings of the significance of the Nataraja, since the Tevaram hymns of the Tamil saints of the 6th to 9th century also portray Shiva as something as a social outcast, which can be perhaps interpreted as an attempted subversion of the caste system, which laid the grounds for the bhakti movement of overcoming the caste barriers through intense personal devotion to a personal god. And there are also problems in dating these icons, since most Hindu images are rarely inscribed. And so what this paper has attempted to do, it puts together archaeometallurgical, astroarchaeological and literary insights to suggest that the origins of the Nataraja goes back to the Pallava period, and that its formulation was understood by a certain cosmic or metaphysical dimension from the significance of early Tamil poetry, and I'll be especially referring to the poetry of Manika Vachakar. Just to quickly run through the historical, it's not going up. Yeah. This is a fine image of Sembian Mahadevi in the Freer Gallery of Art, where it's thought to be a portrait of the celebrated Chola queen, Sembian Mahadevi, circa 940 AD, who was one of the great patrons. And under the 10th, 11th century Chola rulers, technology came to the aid of religion with the casting of huge number of metal icons. Essentially, these bronzes were Utsava Murtis, which were taken out for processional worship. According to Shaiva Siddhanta philosophy, inside the sanctum, it was the aniconic lingam which was worshipped, and these metal images were really cast for processional worship, and they were always elaborately decorated. And several thousands of bronze images were made by the lost wax process, which still continues in the village of Swamimalai. Now, I'll go through these details a bit quickly, because Sangeetha has warned me again to stick very to the time factor. So I won't go too much into these technicalities, but This problem of dating of South Indian bronzes I had tackled by using a combination of spectrochemical and analytical techniques, where the elemental composition and trace element composition was first mapped for different stylistic groups. And I also used a technique known as lead isotope analysis, which basically measures the lead isotope ratios for different groups of bronzes. And these lead isotope ratios are found to cluster together because of similarities in the ore sources. And using both these techniques, it was found that there were discrete metallurgical profiles for different sets of bronzes, whether they were Chola, Pallava, Vijayanagara, etc. And as you can see here, the Pallava bronzes follow this linear trend due to the mixing of lead from two different sources, whereas the Chola bronzes tend to cluster into that group. So using such techniques, one was able to make attributions for bronzes of uncertain stylistic attributions. Anyway, I'll just rub through all this. And one of the important findings from the study was that this bronze Teofale from the Government Museum Chennai, which was thought to be Chola, was actually Pallava. This here is a Pallava bronze for which the stylistic attributes and the lead isotope and trace element profile fitted the Pallava group, and there was also a copper plate found at Kuram which corroborates that. And this is just some of the other bronzes. This is an inscribed Chola bronze which fitted the technical attributions of the Chola period. This is Durga. And these are some of the later bronzes. In the middle is the Vijayanagara bronze, which again fitted the technical fingerprints for the Vijayanagara group. And to that side is a bronze which was thought to be dated to 1510, but actually the lead isotope and other profile fitted the Chola group. So it was possible to actually date some of these bronzes. Now, this is a bronze in the British Museum, Nataraja bronze in the British Museum, which was thought to be Chola, but the lead isotope and trace element evidence suggested that it's actually Pallava. And what was also interesting was that I had this star chart of the constellation Orion mapped onto this bronze. The reason for doing this is that at the temple of Nataraja, at the temple of Nataraja at Chidambaram, the star Ardra is very important. There's a chariot processional festival related to Ardra, which is Betelgeuse, one of the stars of the constellation of Orion. So there's a strong link between the symbolism of Orion and Nataraja, and it seemed to be that there's some link in the iconographic formulation as well. So it's interesting that there could probably already have been a stellar inspiration. And also the star chart was plotted for 800 AD, so the dating also fits with what I found from the scientific analysis. So what does that tell us? So this idea that the Nataraja dated to the Pallava period is not inconsistent with the hymns of Appar, for instance, which talks of a sweet golden foot of the Shiva. And I'll run through this poem of Manikavachikar, which says, "He who creates, protects, and destroys the verdant world, the primeval one. Ah, when will I get to gaze upon the unique one to whom no other compares, him who is fire, water, wind, earth, and ether, him who others cannot understand." Now, coastal Chidambaram is an interesting site because it is the only site where Nataraja is actually worshipped in the sanctum next to a curtain space which represents the Akasha Lingam. And this term, Chidambaram, is thought to be of 12th century vintage because it's a Sanskritic term, Chit plus Ambaram, Chit meaning consciousness and Ambaram meaning cosmos, whereas Thillai in Tamil was the older name. So some scholars have argued that, Some scholars have argued that this whole idea of the link with the cosmic consciousness really is a Sanskritic introduction around the 12th, 13th century when this whole tradition of the Dikshitas and all that came into being. But I find that already in the verses of Manikavachikar dating to the 9th century, that is the Tamil verses of Manikavachikar, this idea of one consciousness or Oru Narve is there. O unique consciousness, which is realized as standing firm, transcending words and ordinary consciousness, oh, let me know a way to tell of you. And there's another hymn by Manikavachikar which again captures this cosmic element. Let us praise the dancer who sports, creating, destroying this heaven, earth, and all else. And finally, I'd like to point out that this notion of the link between the cosmos and the consciousness, I think one could also go back to the Tamil Sangam poetic tradition to understand this whole aspect, which is a very unique phenomenon of the Tamil tradition. The Tamil poetic tradition, which goes back to about 3rd century BC, we think, is based on this thematic separation and interplay between the Agam genre, which is the inner space of love and intimacy, and the Puram genre, which is the outer space of heroic or bardic poetry. And in fact, even in the whole concept of Shaiva Siddhantic worship, where the unitary lingam is worshipped inside the sanctum and the processional images are involved in public worship outside, that also recalls to this Agam Puram conceptualization. Of course, the idea of Sachidananda, which is reflected in Shaiva Siddhantic poetry such as Umapati's verses, do have their Upanishadic roots, but I think to this Tamil tradition actually ties in very closely to the Nataraja. No one has actually really explored this. I think I'm the first person trying to say this. And I found especially there's a verse of Manika Vachakar which brings this out quite beautifully. He revealed his foot like a tender flower, caused me to dance, entered my innermost part, became my Lord. And I find echoes of this interplay of outer and inner space also in Tamil Sangam poetry. For instance, there's a poem from Kuruntogai of the 2nd century BC, as translated by A.K. Ramanujan, which goes, bigger than the earth certainly, higher than the sky, more unfathomable than the water is this love for this man. So to conclude, I've tried to show that the Nataraja imagery and ritual worship does provide a rich visual and metaphorical vocabulary to engage with the inner and outer space of consciousness and the cosmos, and that Kumaraswami's words that it is poetry but nonetheless science is also apt, because this imagery seems to emanate out of ancient Tamil poetic sensibilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharada, for not only the precision in your movements and words, but also being so precise about the time. I think you finished exactly in 20 minutes. We can take a few questions.
It's a relief.
Any questions? Yes, you have? Yes.
Could you just explain the link to consciousness again? The speed with which you went, I sort of missed that, and I'm sort of also grouping. So basically, if you could just make that connection a little bit.
Yeah. Well, the point is that this whole evocation. Oh, sorry, I think I forgot to read out. There's some more of the Shaiva Siddhanta. Anyways, I'm rushing through it. I probably. Yeah. No, the fact is that the Nataraja icon itself, there is this, the whole philosophy that it represents the cosmic consciousness seems to be articulated through the imagery of the bronze itself, through the Tamil poetic evocations, as I said, going back at least to Manika Vachakar, also in the whole, the concept of Chidambaram, at least in the architectonic conception as well as the philosophy that goes behind that temple, and also in the Shaiva Siddhanta ritual, which I forgot to actually read out because I was just rushing through it. There is one passage in the Kanikagama which gives a glimpse into how the ritual aspects of Shaiva Siddhanta worship also connect this world of the inert, which is Jada, and the world of the animate, which is consciousness. And this thing of connecting dualities, which I think also, as I said, goes back to this Agam Puram tradition, and here it is the inert and the animate is Chit or consciousness, and the inert is Jade. And this is a passage from the Kamikagama. One should know that the divine glance distinguishes between what is inert, Jada, and what is animate, Chit, through Shiva's own power of vision. Sprinkling upward renders an object suitable for offering to Shiva by separating it from Jada. Striking brings about the manifestation of Chit in that object, as the striking of stones manifests sparks, and sprinkling downward nurtures these sparks still more. But the point I was trying to make is also that this is not just dependent on the Shaiva Siddhantic texts, but already in the mystical poets' works of Manika Vachakar and all that, this apprehension of Shiva as a cosmic consciousness is already there, which has not been, at least in the art historical literature, that has never been acknowledged. You see, I mean, you're not coming from an art history background. So from the art historical point of view, what I'm saying is significant. Maybe it's not terribly important.
I think that's okay. I think Professor Nataraja himself has a question for you.
There's definitely seems to be a connection between the depiction of the idol and the sadhu concept that Dr. Kapoor talked about this morning.
Mm-hmm.
That, in other words, the Lord of creation or dance and so on seems to be more a hermit, divorced from civilization in order to make civilization.
Sure.
Like to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of, in fact, if you read the Tevaram and all that.
You have to use your microphone.
I mean, the whole Tevaram hymns, if you read, I mean, Shiva is portrayed as this sort of almost like a madman and this sort of social outcast dancing. I mean, somebody who's giving up on the the normal routine of life. And even Manikavachakar himself, he gives up a government job with the Pandyans to become a devotee of Nataraja at Chidambaram, and the whole brood of Shaiva Siddhanta worshippers at Chidambaram are supposed to be like this kind of mystics and hermits and that kind of thing. So there is a sort of move away from recognized tradition, and dance seems to have enabled them to do it, because if you read that verse that I read of Manikavachakar, he revealed his foot and caused me to dance. It shows, and Manikavachakar himself was a dancer, which I don't think people appreciate, that these saints were also so involved with what they were doing that they danced like the Lord. It wasn't just that the Lord danced, and so there was that intimate link there. Yes.
Last question.
Manikavachakar, was he a Nayanmar?
No, actually the Nayanmars refer to the earlier ones, that is Appar and Sambandar and so on. So he's not strictly called a Nayanmar.
The point what you are trying to make out is that Manikavachakar has also had the same opinion that Nataraja represents a creation.
Well, I'm saying it predates...
Is that the one? What is that?
I'm saying it predates this whole Sanskritic influence at Chidambaram, to which it's usually attributed that this is an Upanishadic idea and all that. But I'm trying to say it was already there in this whole Tamil tradition. Yeah.
Idea of creation is there in Nataraja.
Well, you see, because the Nataraja was actually dated to the 10th century, nobody actually has said that it was there prior to that. So the fact that there was that archaeometallurgical sort of identification of that bronze then became important to look at all this pre-extant literature again, because till then it wasn't a question, because it was thought that it referred to
nobody knew the Nataraja.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what you are trying to tell.
Yeah. And of course, to that question of where consciousness links up and such, like in the last talk I had pointed out that it is I think from the history of science point of view of history of science, it is interesting that such ideas were given some visual representation quite early on, because it's only much later that we're talking about all these things like quantum consciousness or this appreciation of mass energy equivalence and all, which has all come about through modern physics, no doubt. But intuitively they seem to have been thinking about these things. Of course, not that it probably went anywhere.
Yeah, I think we should stop. We should stop. I'm sorry. Well, thank you, Sharada, so much for the presentation and the abhinaya you did. So,
I never refuse these opportunities that Sangeetha gives me, because she's the only sport who lets me sort of. She told me, please do abhinaya and don't give us any of your things. So that was nice. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Sharada, once again. Well, it's always a bit painful to leave after 2 days conference, and we almost started thinking the conference just started. Oh God, it's going to end in another 1 hour's time, but we cannot avoid this moment, and perhaps that's the meaning of life. We have to keep moving. So the very last session of this is a panel discussion. Dr. Kapoor is not very well, so he has left for the day, so he will not be there for the panel. And Jean Lechat, as I informed you earlier, he was down with a minor stroke, so he was unable to come for this conference completely. So this panel would, may I request the panelists, Professor B.V. Sreekantan, Professor Ramakrishna Rao, Professor Narayanan Srinivasan, and Professor Unnikrishnan to take your seats. And what we can do is, each of the panelists would speak for, let's say, 5 to less than 10 minutes. So let's say 5 to 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, maximum 9 minutes. on their thoughts. This is a larger theme of the conference itself. The whole idea is to present before you, through these four minds, about 5 to 7 minutes, and then finally we will have an open discussion. So let me request Professor B.V. Sreekantan to begin with. The theme of the panel is the theme of the conference itself. Yes, sir. As you wish. Would you like to come here? Yes, please.
Yesterday, I forgot to tell you that I am not a philosopher. I am only an experimental physicist. And why I got into thinking about consciousness is perhaps relevant. See, when I was reading the Mahavakyas, the four famous sayings from the four Upanishads, one of them says, Prajnanam Brahma. It means consciousness is Brahman. Then, of course, I knew the other three, what Brahman means, that I am Brahman, Tattvamasi, and also I am Atma Brahma, and so on. So what really kept me thinking is, why is consciousness called Brahman? And what is the equivalence between consciousness and Brahman? This led me to think of the parallelism in physics, basically, about what is it that is common to everything that we see around us. Then it turns out that as you go to deeper and deeper levels of investigations, as a physicist, you end up finally in a very peculiar situation. I referred to some parts of it yesterday by just hinting at the Newtonian problem of action at a distance, where Newton himself did not know how the gravitational force goes from one end to the other, from the sun to the... He knew how the intensity decreases, but he did not know how the force is transmitted. And it took almost 300 years to bring in the idea of quantum physics, and then quantum vacuum ideas, and what we call fluctuations in quantum mechanics, and then what we call virtual particles, creation and annihilation, etc. Finally, to bring about some understanding. But in all that, what happens is, in science, what has happened is, we started trying to explain matter. And finally, I gave you some quotations from some of the Nobel laureates to say that ultimately, the ultimate reality is just some kind of substratum, which is identified with what we call quantum mechanical vacuum, which is responsible for everything. What you started out is with matter, but now you have to understand everything in terms of just one entity, all the forces, all the everything that happens in the... And this concept-wise is not very different from the concept of Brahman and what the concept of universal consciousness. So though it's very difficult to relate the individual consciousness to universal consciousness in terms of neurosciences and physics and so on, I personally feel that the concept of universal consciousness, which is behind everything, the way that identifying consciousness with Brahman, is not in a very different sense, different from the concept of science today.
Thank you, Professor Sreekantan. May I request Professor K. Ramakrishna Rao?
I'm very glad that I'm able to be here and participate in this conference, considering the kind of feedback I received, the number of people who wanted to talk to me after the conference is over, after the presentation was over, during the last 2 days. It does suggest to me that there are a number of things that we all seem to share. We may not agree on the solutions and the answers, but I think we all agree that we have discussed here some very fundamental issues, fundamental questions. The nature of consciousness itself is an issue that is too profound to be solved in a conference or in a set of conferences. In fact, consciousness, to my mind, is the most puzzling of all puzzles. I think it was William James who said the concept of self is the most puzzling of the puzzles. But to me, even more primitive than the concept of self is the concept of consciousness, and therefore it, to my mind, is the most puzzling of all the puzzles. As I sit and listen to, as I sat and listened to the various speakers, somehow I was still thinking, what is consciousness? What is consciousness? How can I describe it? I have attempted to study consciousness for a number of years, attempted to describe it, attempted to investigate it in a number of ways, but always I was haunted by the apprehension that what I'm talking about or what I'm doing about is probably not consciousness but something else. So what is this thing called consciousness? How broadly can I look at this concept of consciousness? You can't look at it any broader than the notion of the Brahman, which is very encompassing, as Dr. Sreekantan had just pointed out. To me, it looks as though the universe is an information system. All of that exists. Reality is nothing but an information system. So out of that information system, you extract information. In the process of extracting that information, you bifurcate that system into two, and one is consciousness. It is the quintessence, it is the ground condition that makes it possible for us to retrieve information about things that exist. In so doing, you necessarily make a dichotomy, make a distinction between information and the thing to which this information relates. And this process of retrieving information takes place at different points in time, at different centers in the universe itself, and consequently we have the notion of individual consciousness or the person attempting to retrieve this information from a particular spot, and this is the individual consciousness. But the whole thing is nothing but an information system. We are extracting that information. In order to do that, we have to have this basic overall governing principle, which is the ground condition of all knowledge. That to me is consciousness. But on the other hand, if we limit consciousness to any kind of a manifestation consequent to certain biological permutations and combinations, biological interactions or cortical processes, I think we are missing the whole boat. We have to consider it in its larger perspective, and that being, it is the center, it is the essence, it is the basic ground for all awareness. And that awareness can manifest, as I said, in the other ways, in a number of forms. I was able to think about 4 or 5 different forms, but others can possibly classify them into more forms. All that becomes necessary in as much as the processing of information is itself a part of the information. And this is the tricky issue. And this is probably the knot that we have to untie. Until we do that, we will continue to have the same conundrum, the same puzzle continuing to haunt us. Thank you.
Professor Narayanan.
Well, actually, I'm going to take an opposite route. So I'm not going to talk about Brahman, I'm not going to talk about universe. The only thing we can confident of is that we are conscious. Okay, so I will start with humans. It's very simple. You don't have to define consciousness. It's very easy.
If you're going to do an experiment with humans, we do it all the time. Ask the person. So I show something on the screen, I ask you, what do you see? You say a red circle, then I will say you experienced a red circle. It's very simple, it's not at all complicated, and that's the way we do the science, number one. Number two, there are certain things I would start with rather the simpler picture and then go ahead. For example, to me, there are only two things. You're unconscious of certain processing or information, whatever way you want to call it, or you become conscious of it. So in my starting with a simpler approach, you're either unconscious or conscious of something. There are certain things you will not be conscious of at all. For example, some processing that is occurring in your retina, which is of course doing a processing, there is no chance that we probably will be conscious of. It will be what we call an intermediate processing stage or intermediate representation. So some things of course we can be conscious of, but we may not be conscious of. For example, I showed you the demo, motion-induced blindness. It's on the screen, the dot is there, but there are times you are not aware of the dot. So just because the stimulus is there doesn't mean you will be aware of it. Okay, so the simple issue is you are unconscious of something, you can become conscious of it. Easiest way to think about it is think of it as some sort of a threshold. So if some concept or some information goes above the threshold, you are conscious of it. Now the question is what's happening underneath, and that's one of the ways to study it. The other way, there are two other issues here. One is experience. When people ask me, do you study experience? I say no. I don't think we can study experience. What we study are relationships between experience. Okay, so when I show you something red and then you respond in a way, and I show you something blue, I'm talking about a relationship in your experience between red and blue. Within itself, it is very difficult, or I would say almost impossible, and it's probably not worthwhile to study it. Another easy way to think about it is think of the world. And there are various things in the world. Put it in a circle, there are lots of points. Think of your mind as another circle here. So everything, let's assume for simplicity, as a corresponding thing inside the mind. So there is something in the world, it's a simplistic thing, there's something in the mind. So you can link. So some red apple on there has a representation in my mind, which represents the red apple. Okay, now red apple is related to the green apple in a certain way. So now we will ask a question, the representation of the red apple and the representation of the green apple, how they are related to each other. In fact, that is what, when we do a psychological experiment in psychophysics, question we are asking. So what we are really asking a question of is relationships between representations or relationships between experience. And when you understand all these relationships, you understand pretty much everything. So when you try to remove everything, then you say, I want to understand experience. Maybe it is there, maybe it is not there, but I don't think it's possible at all. We always experience, but all experiencing is always in relation to something else. Okay? Even when you say something is red, it is a relationship statement. For example, the same thing, you will not perceive it as red on some other day, maybe some other time, you will not perceive it as same thing. It's always with respect to something. So if you understand it that way, I think that's the easiest way to go. So in that sense, we have been studying consciousness for more than 100 years. And the other point of view is, you just look at relationships, and when you come to knowledge, the only way we acquire knowledge is through interaction with the world. A lot of times it is not emphasized. I know we go to Brahman, but at least normally, how do you acquire knowledge? We acquire knowledge only by interacting with the world. So our representations are created, destroyed, interchanged, transformed through interacting with the world. If you don't interact with the world, you will not acquire any knowledge. And it is the interactions of how we interact with the world that will tell you about what sort of knowledge we acquire. So it's a process, so you have perception, action, think of it as a cycle. It's constantly going on, constantly going on, and that is what we call knowledge. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Narayanan. Professor Unnikrishnan.
I was not really prepared for this. Also, as a physics researcher, I'm aware of the danger of speaking about something which is not so well defined. So I thought, I don't study consciousness as an object. I study the physical world. So my interest in the conscious mind is how it responds to the physical world on one part. And another aspect which I am deeply interested in is how it responds to explorations inwards. Okay. So I'm interested in both, and that's what attracts me towards such meetings. Of course, probably you are aware that a professional physics researcher is not supposed to attend such conferences. Okay. For example, when I tell my research students that I am going to Bangalore to attend this conference, they actually start laughing. And but since they have some respect for me, it's still okay. Anyway, so one thing which was interesting to me, which was discussed here, is this aspect of aesthetics, for example. As a researcher, for example, when you look at the physical world, so it's not just studying the properties of the physical world. I certainly look at the physical world as a Rasika. This is why I was quite fascinated by the way Ganesh talked about some of these things. What is a Rasika? Even as a physics researcher, you can be a Rasika who is looking at the world, its properties and so on, and then looking at how the world affects you, not just intellectually, but also emotionally. So part of my research has been quite involved with how the physical laws themselves are formed by the properties of the universe as a whole, and how all natural laws are somehow fixed by various properties of the physical universe. And then when you go fairly deep into that kind of research, which is essentially involving one's individual conscious mind deeply into the properties of the universe, one realizes that what you get from that kind of a research tells you how inseparably you are linked. It's just a physical link, but how inseparably you are linked to everything else in the universe. This is a physical link, but this is also a spiritual experience, as you can imagine. I don't want to go into the details of those kind of results, but as what one gets out finally from that kind of pure physics research is this outer harmonizing feeling. Okay, just like Mrinalini Sarabhai talked about here, certain harmony with various things in nature, the outer nature. That's one aspect of it. So this pleasure experienced by the individual conscious mind, this attracts me, and that is one way I study consciousness in an indirect way. Okay, its response to the physical world. Then, of course, the other part, which I have not experimented with much, though I can see there are a lot of people here who have been experimenting with inner experiences in various ways. There are various ways of doing it, of course. I have tried various sorts of things, but see, this requires a lot of courage. Dealing with physical world outside, that requires training, some aptitude for mathematics, physics, and subjects like that, and a sense for observation, respect for physical world. You don't need so much courage, though it requires certain courage when you want to ask new questions. For example, people have asked me, coming from a small middle class background from a small town in Kerala, how do I dare ask certain questions which I ask? I said, no problem. In our culture, a small child could go all the way to the god of death and ask about the meaning of life after death. I mean, with such profound questions being asked and recorded, what's my problem? I don't need much more, courage and motivation to ask these small questions. So that part is okay. But to look inwards into consciousness, this requires a lot of courage because you don't know what to expect. In fact, you might change so much that you may not be even able to come back to your normal sense. So there are various ways of experimenting. For example, standard, a lot of talks here talked about meditation. I have not experimented much with meditation, though my teacher is sitting here The only technique which I got trained was in TM for a short while, and my teacher is sitting here actually, by chance I met him. Anyway, so I have mildly experimented with such things. I have experimented with the kind of things Mrinalini's talked about. I cannot, I mean, though I am big, I don't walk like an elephant, not as elegant. But I have tried with musical instruments which will make me feel like an elephant, like a saxophone. Okay, and one single good note played in that, you know, that feeling you get of harmony, it goes all the way to the animal which this instrument represents. So there are various ways of experiment. You can also experiment with other things, various leaves, liquors, possible. I mean, that's also exploring consciousness in a very, and that's another technique. But of course, there are deeper techniques, which I have not tried out, but there are people who have tried. So all these possibilities. So if I compare ways of exploring conscious, 1 minute, looking at the outer world, those are, the prescriptions are more or less well defined. Explorations of research. Even I would say neurophysiological research of various sorts will fall into that, and you will gain learning about various things, valuable knowledge. Perhaps the inner experience explorations are more rewarding, I don't know. And this requires several kinds of techniques. Some techniques we may not be even aware of now. And people have experimented with various things, and therefore the value of such conferences, as I see it, various kinds of people come together. And when we meet each other, of course, a physicist might think that somebody else who is exploring some kind of a tantric technique might be crazy fellow. I mean, it's possible. But I see that with repeated dialogues, I have changed these opinions slowly, especially when people don't take extreme positions. And so therefore, this dialogue between people coming to such conferences, irrespective of what techniques they use, external or internal, I think can only make a good progress towards understanding how consciousness interacts with inner self and outer self. I don't know whether all this will help in understanding consciousness itself. That I don't know. But certainly it will help in giving us more about how conscious mind harmonizes with the inner self and outer self in a much deeper way, which even that we don't understand very well now. So I have nothing much to say except making these scattered comments. Maybe in the discussion it can be more concrete. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Unnikrishnan. We can have this session open for discussion, but before that, a few thoughts. Unni said that I have not experimented with inner experiences, but when he qualified himself as a Rasika and being a physicist, I was wondering what sort of experience would that be? Can a researcher see how the world influences you not only by the physical laws, but also how emotionally how it influences you? Narayanan Srinivasan said that defining consciousness might be a problem, but it will be easier and more clear if you try to see what are basic sensory experiences, because mostly we study the relationships between experiences and not experience per se. And we always experience in relation to something else. Professor Ramakrishna Rao noted that we may not have all the answers, but we have for sure discussed certain fundamental basic questions. And to him, it's important to take consciousness in a larger perspective. Professor Sreekantan considers that the idea of universal consciousness, which is so dominant in Indian traditions, is also an idea which is today very much reflecting in the developments of science. So we can see that these are 4 different perspectives, but 4 interesting and important perspectives. The whole idea of this conference was not to give the final answer for what is consciousness, to judge what is real experience, and to say which way of knowing is the best way of knowing. The whole idea of this conference was to debate with the ideas which we think are important in 3 areas such as science, philosophy, and the arts, and to extend our questions, to extend our imagination when we ponder into basic questions. Can we extend our questions? Can we redefine our questions? Because that itself will be a major step in our progress towards understanding something very complex like consciousness, something very complex like our own experiences, and to even understand how exactly you define as something as a way of knowing.
Going for a conference of this kind. But yesterday I showed quotations from none other than the physicists, the topmost physicists of the 20th century, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Einstein, Pauli, and so on. You see, and they were not doing philosophy, they were not doing consciousness studies and such things.
I can do that if I have a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, that's the mistaken notion that people have. That's what I was trying to say, that there is really no reason why anybody should venture into this area. It is not at all an area in which we should taboo by scientists or something like that. It's a wrong notion that the students have. If they have, that should be removed. The other question is, we are not answering the question, what is ontology, what is epistemology? So we think that consciousness is something like software. What about the hardware, which is equally important? And what I am trying to say is, unless you make hardware and software, you see, one and the same, there are various ways of putting it. What you are seeing and what you are experiencing, there is no way so far found out by science which can, in fact, even the question of objective world and subjective world, these are all, in my opinion, distinctions which you have made, because you cannot call something objective per se, because you have only one experience, that is the experience within yourself. Even when you do an experiment, ultimately it is what is happening in your own brain that is important. So what is objective is of no use. Even if I take a photograph of something, unless I interpret it, it's of no use actually, kind of. You can make it somewhat free of subjective biases. That's a different question. But ultimately, in terms of interpretation, this difference between subjective and objective is purely one that is drawn for argument's sake and nothing else. That's my opinion.
Yes, thank you, Professor Sreekantan, once again. We can open this session for discussion, but when Unni said that about his students, I thought it's also like complimenting, because the students think that if Unni has to go for that, maybe there's some meaning in it. So maybe it's so let's open this for discussion. Yes, so I will have a tough job, and so I would say that we are not sitting here to answer all your questions, so you can say your comments as well. Not necessary that you also always have to ask a question since you're sitting there, but it could be in the form of a comment. But I would appreciate that if it is clear and limited and short. Yes, to begin with you.
My question, or rather comment, is for Professor Sreekantan. Yesterday when I was thinking about it, I came to think of the fact that we are always trying to quantify things, define something in terms of smaller units. And I was thinking in terms of beauty. Let's say that of a rose flower, the way you put it yesterday. The physical looks of the flower are very describable in terms of what we know. But just by defining that, I cannot make a person imagine a rose flower who's never seen a rose flower. So there is this response of me to the flower also, which makes the flower beautiful. So what is beautiful to me may not be beautiful to you. So doesn't that mean that quantifying beauty itself contradicts beauty? It destroys the beauty of beauty. So what's your take on something like that?
What I tried to point out yesterday was that while science can quantify things, there is no way you can quantify beauty. Precisely for the reason you are saying that what you consider beautiful, somebody else may not consider beautiful. And even if you consider beautiful, you can only compare it with something else. But there is no quantifying meter for beauty, basically. In as much as there is no consciousness meter.
But there is beauty in quantification.
Pardon?
But there is beauty in quantification.
Beauty in quantification may be there. That is the beauty of science. That is kind of thing. But there is, that's a very nice way of putting it. There is beauty in quantification, and that is the merit of science, basically. But very soon we find that in science, there are things which you can quantify, and there are things which you cannot quantify. Let me tell you, the whole of quantum mechanics was built on the basis of the so-called psi. And psi, you see, until it was interpreted as some probability wave, nobody was knowing what is it that is waving. See, there was no physical parameter there which was waving. But still, the whole of wave mechanics was developed on the assumption that there is something which is waving. In fact, there is a very nice instance. Two people who go and ask the question, when a flag is waving like that, fluttering, then he said, is it the wind that is waving, or is it the cloth that is waving? Then the teacher is supposed to have said, it's neither of them, it is your mind that is waving.
That's a good one. The question which was asked about beauty, she is Miss Pritesh Dagur. I don't know whether I pronounce your last name correctly. She is doing a PhD in Indian Institute of Science, and when she introduced herself, she thought why she is attending this conference. She said, to quote her, "I can sit through a whole day of lecture that tells me how to think better." Yes, the next question. Yes, please be short.
Sreekantan sir was telling that we are not trying to tell what is the ontology and epistemology. We are not trying to define. I think Srinivasan sir was trying to say the knowledge where we are trying to establish the relationship between different objects. Are you suggesting something like logic? Logic is that is the purpose what the logic will do. It tries to relate the different concepts of the world. Are you?
Not really. Knowledge representation is right, but it need not be logic. There are a lot of ways to represent knowledge, and logic would be one of the ways to represent knowledge. But there are any number of ways, other ways to do it.
I would like to respond to Dr. Srinivasan's very frank assessment of the situation. The question is, can consciousness be equated with the brain processes? This is the fundamental question. If the essence of consciousness can, in some sense, be appropriately depicted by the physiological information that we have, the issues of consciousness that have been raised would not have been risen. Attempts have been made for almost 70, 80 years to throw consciousness completely out from psychological discussions. And increasingly, people became aware that this cannot be done. You cannot throw consciousness out without losing something very basic to human nature. Now, in attempting to say that you can make a distinction between consciousness and the unconscious states, and this is something that you can observe, is, I think, oversimplifying the situation. If consciousness only means focal awareness, there is much to mentation that we have missed. And more importantly, mentation in the Indian tradition is a physical act, but consciousness goes beyond that. There are some essential definitional differences between mere mentation and being conscious. So restricting consciousness to our focal awareness or being aware of something that you can introspectively say, yes, I know or I do not know, he is limiting the scope of consciousness to an unacceptable degree. Take, for example, a patient in surgery under anesthesia. Is he conscious or unconscious? From behavioral perspective, he is unconscious. You ask him to say, do you hear what is being done, or do you feel the pain? No. But yet we do know that the person in anesthesia, his recovery can be influenced by the ambience, what is said while surgery is being performed. There is significant information that is available to us which says that what goes on in the operating room could affect and influence the recovery of the patient. Now, is the patient conscious? In some sense, he is conscious. So you can't throw out that aspect of consciousness. If you do, I'm afraid you are restricting yourself to what you consider to be manageable, researchable areas, but you are missing the very essence of consciousness itself.
Thank you, Professor Rao. Would you like to respond?
I would add one more. That is the phenomenon of Ramanujan. See, Ramanujan had nothing in his memory of being taught any mathematics, which it has to be somewhere else, basically.
There was no interaction.
There was no, yes. So nothing was stored in his brain, but he used to come out with such, how does it happen if it is the way that...
Would you like to respond now, Narayan, or maybe a few more questions come and later, because I see a lot of hands if I have to do justice. Yes, from this side, I think usually you don't see the right side. Okay. All right, from there, yes, Ajit Prasad.
My question is to Dr. Narayanan Srinivasan regarding his opinion about denying the experience and having to observe rather the alpha and the gamma level signals to study the whole of consciousness. Of course, the establishing of the psychophysical correlation is pretty important, but to me, what seems to be grossly missing in the approach is to give an example as an analogy. Consider the case where just two computers are connected by a network. And if you're trying to study how this communication is going to happen, if you just look at the wire connecting the two and just trying to see what an electron is trying to do there, you're not going to reach anywhere. You need to build up all the abstraction about that, understand what kind of communication, what kind of modulation is happening there to make some sense out of it. And when you try to study the meditative experience, you need to not only look at the calm abiding state about the alpha signal reaching somewhere, but also about what is the initial condition of the meditation. Is it starting from a loving compassion kind of a mode? Is it from a devotional point of view? How is the meditation starting? All meditations start with the calm abiding, but with some other attributes to that. It is important to study those, even in psychophysical correlations. It becomes important to study all these aspects together.
Yes.
And just to give another example about Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai talking and giving a performance here. At least those who can appreciate aesthetics, there is a level of spiritual and aesthetical experience which gets conveyed when she do the expressions. And this itself doesn't get formulated by her in her speech or in a mudra right directly. There is a level of abstraction in the experience which she formulates and the experience which gets communicated. Of course, there is a physical connection to that, but it needs to be studied in a holistic manner, not just at one signal at the cortical level.
Okay. Before I request Dr. Narayan to respond, somebody else has a similar question. Is it similar to what he? Is it a response to that, or it's an extended question? Is it a question? Okay, then let's wait for some more time, Dilip. Okay, because I would like Narayanan to respond to that, unless you think it's okay. Go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I think you completely misrepresented. I never said deny the experience. I think that was a big misquote. In fact, the first slide, first part itself said I respect the phenomenology of experience. I'm not saying these people do not experience what they experience. All I am trying to say is I'm trying to find the correlates of those experiences. As for specific details about the way to study meditation, that is whatever you're saying is what we are trying to do. We are trying to compare different types of meditation, and alpha power is just one of the measures that are used, and it is not the end of the story. It's the first step, it's the beginning of the story. And it was never claimed that explains all of meditative experience or it will explain everything. If that is the case, then I don't have to do any more research because that is already known for 30, 40 years. So that's it. As far as abstraction is concerned, yes, we do abstract. In fact, when you talk about perception and cognition, even when I use the word representation, which actually is the common word that is used in computer science as well as psychology, that's an abstraction itself. If you are a computer science student, you can go back and read Turing and Church. That's what I'm talking about.
I also thought Narayan made sense and clear when he said that we always experience in relation to something else. So if we experienced what Dr. Mrinalini explained and expressed as a sort of spiritual experience, that's because we have something else to compare it with, which we think would not belong to spiritual experience. So I also thought that his point was not denying experience.
My point there is more about, okay, just studying the cortical signal responses is not just good enough. You even need to study, okay, maybe some ECG responses, maybe other aspects of the body, how the whole body reacts to the experience.
Yeah.
So it needs to be broader. That's the point that I was trying.
I agree.
Is Badrili had something to add to this?
He told about the abstraction part of it, and I think making it something abstract will actually mislead, probably. Even when Narayan sir said, like, we do abstraction and we do have representation and all in our mind, we are making a mistake of taking it to consideration that we have a representation in our mind, that there is a world and there is a world inside. When there is an interaction happening together with the world, there need not be any representation as such. There need not be any abstraction as such. And even with K. Ramakrishna Rao, what he says, like consciousness is something which is beyond whatever he calls it. There also is making some kind of abstraction, which we do not know. We do not know. It's a beyond. So while making something an abstract thing, we are actually not coming down. Even if we take an example of electrons, we don't know what electron is, but still we build up a story upon that electron and that abstraction, and finally say we do not know, this is false. So first I think we should stop making that kind of abstraction and look at what is possible.
Yes, Dilip, I think you definitely have a point there, but sometimes it's also important to make certain abstractions so that our concepts gets modified and redefined and we can extend our imagination. Whether we say those are the final things, that's a matter of... can we take a couple of more questions?
I think there is a distinction to be made between modeling and abstracting. What we are talking about is not an abstraction, it's a model. You envisage a model to understand consciousness. That's not an abstraction from the data. It is a model which you would use to generate hypotheses, which you can test. The whole purpose of it is not to hide something away from reality in some abstract form, but to have a model that would generate theories and hypotheses which could actually be tested. No, the model I had mentioned, in fact it may be even a meta theory in some sense, is that the universe, reality, is an information system. And that's not an abstraction, that's a modeling. If reality is an information system, how you study it, how you deal with it. And I'm saying that consciousness is what allows us to have information extracted out of this reality. It's a model, it's a philosophical model from which you have to generate. I mean, it's not something that you can sort of, it's not 2 + 2 is 4.
All right, okay.
In fact, I want to add something to your comment about electron. See, electron also is a concept. You use that concept to go ahead and do some calculations and then predict something and explain something. You cannot catch an electron in your hand. Same thing about mass, same thing about, these are all concepts which we use, which are very useful for us, and we can even quantify them. But you have got to give them up finally to say that, so much of mass is equal to so much of energy, which is more fundamental concept, I don't know. I mean, it depends upon your, for what purpose you want the answer, actually. So, the way science has progressed, if you want to bring in entities like electrons, you must understand in what context they have been brought and why they have been brought. Electron is considered to be a particle with so many properties. It has got a spin, it has got a charge, it has got a mass, etc. Very good. But the question is, in spite of all that, you have got to explain that in terms of something else, which is more fundamental. You have to explain its mass, you have to explain its charge, you have to explain its spin, so many quantities. So concepts play a very abstraction, which is equivalent to concepts, plays a very important role in the advancement of science and knowledge.
Yeah, let's, and that side, anybody has a question? Yes, you have, okay.
Actually, since there are many software engineers, I just wanted to make a sort of a funny comment about this. That it's like, if you're asking that what do we think about consciousness, it's like asking what Windows thinks about itself. It's something like that. I mean, Windows operating system, it's residing on in the hardware of it. So if you ask Windows, what do you think about the computer that you are residing? It's something like that. That's the kind of analogy I would like to make. But on a more serious note, what I would like to ask the panelists is, we have talked about meditation and these kind of methods of trying to realize oneself. There is, I mean, as scientists, as artists, and in different fields, many times we come up with a concept which wasn't existing before. I mean, it's something new, or maybe it's a composition, or maybe a dance drama, as Dr. Mrinalini Sarabhai said. So it's something which is generating, which wasn't existing before. It just came. I don't know from where it came. So how is that comparable to, in the sense of meditation, or in that sense? Means what is how do you relate that to an experience of meditation, or that something on that, comment on that or something like that?
Thank you, Nataraja. Any panelists would like to respond to him or take more questions now? Okay. Okay, Narayan.
Well, when you start looking at those sort of issues like creativity, it is the introspective experience that it comes up suddenly. The explanations of how creative ideas come up, some have been proposed, and for example, one which actually uses Darwinian principles. So actually, there is nothing that comes up suddenly. It's all small variations only. And then you can envisage an evolutionary type process operating, if you want, inside your mind, with various ideas interacting with each other, and then slowly changing. So, and okay, whatever that finally occurs to you, you think it's sudden, but the underlying process may not be sudden. Okay.
All right. Yes. Well, I think before I go, I think I saw Subhash Sharma's hand, and there are a couple of hands. Yes, Subhash.
I think my take home from this conference is that there are 4 roads to understand consciousness, and the 4 roads are being represented by the 4 speakers here.
So you have to follow them.
So
you'll be in trouble.
So no, only thing is, if there is a crossover, there may be possibility of accident. So so in terms of my framework, Srinivasan represents the division approach to consciousness. Unni represents the division approach, and Professor Rao represents the direct vision, and he represents the divine vision. That is the 4th step. So it's Subhash, in all seriousness, Subhash, because this is what is the essence.
Yes.
So we see the combination of the science and the art and the philosophy and spirituality sitting on the table.
Thank you, Subhash, for localizing everything. But I also hope you will come up with a matrix 2 and matrix 3, and I guess this is matrix 1. Okay. Yes, just 1 second. Yes, I think I saw another hand here somewhere. Anand, you had a question. Yes.
Well, consciousness per se, to take it exclusively, setting aside religion, God, soul, and all other ideas, because that's like opening up Pandora's box. And looking at it per se, we get to understand that there are two dimensions of it, one on the higher side and another on the lower side. The lower side, what you call the impurities, which is getting mixed up, on account of which one is caught in a cage and one has to purify to reach to the higher state. So there are a lot of live examples that we can relate to. For example, after-death experiences, which have been case recorded in several anecdotal experiences. And when we take up such cases, we can go deeper into understanding what exactly is consciousness, delinking it from any kind of a school of thought as such. One miracle, for example, which is happening in Bangalore every year after year, is that there is a temple called Gavi Gangadhar temple, and in this temple, on the day of Shankaranti, the sun enters into the temple exactly at 5:20 p.m. And afterwards, the sunlight passes through, and it gets onto the bull, and it passes in between the horns of the Nandi, and it goes further up and falls on the Shivalinga. After that, it stays on the Shivalinga and bathes the linga completely with its sunlight for 3 minutes, and it disappears. This happens every year at 5:20, only on the day of Shankaranti, Mahar Shankaranti. Why is it happening? Is it not a miracle? Is it not some sort of a great phenomenon? And why is no physicist or a scientist taking it very seriously?
Okay,
so now, cutting short my comment with that respect, I'm putting a question to Professor Ramakrishna Rao, that you spoke about the principles. And sir, I would like to know what all the governing principles, as you understand, which are governing consciousness, and what exactly is the aim behind these principles? Thank you.
Would you like to respond now, or maybe take a few more questions? Can we take a few more questions? Okay. Yes.
I would like to raise what I believe to be very important and fundamental issues in the whole process of discussing about consciousness. I'll try to make it short and brief. First and foremost, I want to raise a question about different levels of description and analysis. Okay? And also I want to know about how they are related to or map onto each other. Okay. Now to go into the specific question, first and foremost, we could agree that consciousness is a property of living beings, and therefore I would like to ask, in terms of the ultimate causation, okay, what are the, let's say, the evolutionary processes, okay, which led to genesis of a, let's say, a complex nervous system, which is correlated with consciousness? I think we would do well to focus very clearly on such issues. And after that, the second question that I would like to raise is, we try to understand things in terms of, let's say, physicochemical properties. So my question would be, how would information or experience be encoded or represented in neural networks? And I would just like to elicit comments upon how we can analyze the properties of interacting neural networks to understand how the information is represented, transformed, with due reference to neural network modeling and concepts such as the Turing machine. And if one of any of the panelists would just comment upon the kind of the integration or the interrelationship between the different levels at which we can describe, from the neural networks to, let's say, the mind and cognition to consciousness, starting the whole business down to the human genome, which is responsible for the...
Okay, that's a massive question, I would think. Yes, absolutely. Would anybody, I think Mahesh Ursekar wants to ask something. We said that we can't guarantee answers, but we guarantee you can ask questions.
Yeah, I had a comment, and also maybe I don't know if anyone has been exposed or done experiments on this particular aspect, but it has been widely written about. The feeling I got from the conference was, at least it was a feeling. It may not be what the speakers actually felt, believe in, that it seemed to say that somehow the brain is responsible for consciousness in some sense or the other, or its consciousness is closely related to the brain. But I was just wanting to point out to something called the out-of-body experiences that have been widely written about, and people like J. Krishnamurti, who is a very respected sage, has also said that he has had some experiences like that. And to bring it closer, my sister-in-law has had a similar experience, which shows that consciousness need not be restricted to this body-mind complex, and you can go out of your body and actually see your body lying asleep. So maybe it's just a thought. I don't know what experiments have been done, but it's something that's to be thought about, that you could have a conscious experience outside your body. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's true. We have narratives about Ramana Maharshi's near-death experiences and how he was influenced by the two near-death experiences he had, and how his whole philosophy and how he looked at life emerged from those near-death experiences. Certainly they have a very important place. Is Mr. Ganesh? I think you have
It's a question for everyone. Can science really give answers for consciousness and experience? Because there is a fundamental difference between the way we approach the science and the way we approach the religion. I think partly this experience, consciousness, falls into this category of religion or whatever you speak about. In the science, we keep on, the fundamental approach is the doubt. You keep on doubting about something, and at last something which you can't doubt, and you say, okay, this is what the theory is about. But whereas when you come to the consciousness or experience, it is just a personal experience, or it's individualistic, wherein you just can't say anything about it, right? So there you have to believe. So the belief approach is more towards consciousness and all the stuff. Whereas the science takes a doubt approach. Can these two come together? Or science, does it really give answers to consciousness and experience?
To take any questions now? Would you like to make any responses?
See, after all, what is science? Science is to explore and understand what is happening and find out up to what point you can explain. Because it's wrong to think that science is going to explain everything. But by a process of approximation, by experimentation, you go up to a certain level of explanation. And beyond that, you throw up your hands and say that I can't do anything better than this at the present stage. Because, even in leave alone consciousness, even in other problems, we have had difficulties. For example, when radioactivity was discovered, we did not know. It could not be fitted into anything that was known at that time. So some new breakthroughs came. So that's the way science approaches these problems. Consciousness also, it is what is being attempted. Now it's, consciousness may not be the sole property of the brain, but certainly brain is involved in it. That you cannot deny, because if somebody gets hurt on the head, then he does lose his consciousness, basically. So, there were times when they thought consciousness was in the heart and somewhere else and so on. So, but now neurosciences have established many details about all that happens in the neurons and things like that. So from the eye, for example, they have taken all the information now to something, to the visual cortex, the pulses there, the electrical pulses and the neurotransmitter chemicals. That's a great advance. And that advance has helped the medical science enormously. Using that kind of knowledge, they have been able to kind of use it for surgery, use it for medication and things like that. But it is still not answered the fundamental question of consciousness. What they are trying to do is, with the type of instrumentation that is available now, to go nearer and nearer to the spatial and temporal locations where things happen. That's the only thing that science can do. And with the existing concepts and with the existing theories and with the existing instrumentations, one has come to a certain limit. But that doesn't mean that science will not be able to go ahead, still deeper level of explanation.